Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I also would like to rise and give my support to this bill, and I want to say up front that nothing in this bill changes the amount of water that will be provided to for environmental purposes, I should say, under the Basin Plan. That figure broadly remains at a level of 2,750 gigalitres, although there is an adjustment mechanism that was in the Basin Plan, which provides some range around that figure. But this bill does not change that one iota. Does not change the water that will be provided to the environment. And when I was here earlier listening to Senator Rhiannon say that somehow this reveals that the Nationals in particular, and the Coalition by extension, don't care for the environment and are not prioritising the environment. Well, the question has to go back. How does that reveal any lack of concern for the environment when it doesn't actually change the amount of water that will be provided to the environment? What it does change, it only changes one thing. What it does change is how we will recover that water to provide for the environment. So the Greens' opposition to this, the Greens' isolated opposition to this, reveals their true agenda. It's not to protect the environment, it's because they oppose irrigation. It's not because they want to protect wetlands, it's because they don't like intensive agriculture and they want to destroy the jobs. They want to destroy the jobs in the communities that rely on intensive agriculture for their livelihoods and their sustenance. And also, may I add, all of the great food, affordable food, that Australians are used to being able to consume. There are many farmers that rely on the Murray-Darling Basin and families that rely on those farmers making an income. And the Greens want to make sure we have unrestricted buybacks to rip the economic guts out of these communities, to rip the economic rug from underneath those farming families. And we in the Nationals Party and the Coalition in particular are opposed to that kind of approach. We're opposed to that kind of approach because we actually support families that live in the basin. We support the jobs that are created in the basin. We support the very diverse and affordable food that all Australians can eat thanks to the Murray-Darling Basin. Because up front, this is something that's really important for the whole country. It's not just important for the 2.1 million people and the families that live in the basin. It's important for all Australians because we all rely on the food that is grown in the Murray-Darling Basin every week when we go down to Coles and Woolies. Every week when you go down to the supermarket, you're most likely buying something that was grown or started to be grown in the Murray-Darling Basin because it accounts for 40%, a full 40% of the agriculture that's grown in Australia. And Australians are used to being able to have pretty cheap food. They're used to being able to access cheap food at a low price. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if we were to shut down the Murray-Darling Basin, which the Greens want to do with a crazy target of 6,700 gigalitres, that would completely remove Australians' ability to buy cheap food in their shopping trolleys every week. So it wouldn't just affect the families in the basin, it would affect every family in this country if we were to follow the Greens' approach, stop our ability to grow food and make food more expensive across our entire country. I don't support that. I want to support people that grow our food in this nation, and this bill helps to do that. It helps to do that because it re-emphasises that this government is committed to finding an environmental outcome which is practical and does not reduce the productive capacity of Murray-Darling Basin communities. There are two broad ways to recover water. There's a third way which I'll go into later in the speech, but there are two broad ways to recover water to go back to the environment. And I agree with Senator Rhiannon in her speech when she mentioned that we have over-allocated water in the Murray-Darling Basin. All sides of politics agree with that, and indeed it was the former Howard government that kicked this process off on Australia Day in 2007. There was an over-allocation, but there are two broad ways to deal with that over-allocation. One way is to buy the water back from farmers, or take them back if you want, but buy them back from farmers and reduce the amount of water that is used, or reduce the amount of water that's used for food production, therefore reduce the amount of food that's produced in the Murray-Darling Basin. That's one way. The other way is that we invest in ways of using water more efficiently so that we can still produce the same amount of food and fibre in the basin, the same number of jobs, the same food for the same prices we currently enjoy, but use the water savings we make from those efficiency investments to go towards the environment. That's the other way to do it. And I believe we should emphasise that way, not the buyback way. The buyback way destroys communities. The buyback way destroys jobs. The buyback way lessens our ability to grow cheap and affordable food. The infrastructure way is the smart way because it makes us use water smarter and more efficiently, and we can still provide that water to the environment, but we won't undermine the economic efficiency of basin communities. And that's exactly what this bill does. This bill does that because it gives basin communities, the 2.1 million people in the basin, the certainty that the basin plan won't buy back more than 1,500 gigalitres. That's a lot of water. It's a lot of water. It's 3 times the size of Sydney Harbour in round terms. 3 times the size of Sydney Harbour every year that we'll be buying back on average. But it is much better to cap that amount and provide that certainty than leave an open-ended commitment that doesn't allow people in the basin to plan for their futures and invest in their own lives. I noted that Senator Rhiannon talked about the need to provide certainty to the environment, that frogs and fishes and wetlands and trees and all these other wonderful things in God's green planet deserve certainty. They deserve certainty and how to plan their futures. Well, actually, I think people deserve that certainty too. I think people are part of our natural environment, a pretty important part of our natural environment, just as important, if I may, go out on a limb, as trees, frogs and wetlands as well, and they deserve certainty, and this bill provides them that certainty. Now, there has been some contention and some controversy that the Water Act cannot deliver a triple bottom line approach, which is what I'm proposing here. I think we should treat people, the environment, trees and frogs, and the society as well, our social structure and our communities, on an equal and level playing field. I think they should all be considered in a balanced way when we come into this place and make decisions on this basis. And those decisions need to be informed by the values we have, not just the raw numbers and data that we have access to, because it goes to a values choice about how much you value someone's job, how much you value someone's community. Those things are really important and have to be and should be considered on an equal basis as environmental factors, and that is what is broadly known as the triple bottom line. Now, I can understand why some consider the Water Act may fail to deliver such a triple bottom line, because in the construction of the Water Act at a federal level, it did get quite complicated, because we, at a federal level, the Commonwealth Government, do not have constitutional powers over our river systems, and particularly over irrigation. It's reserved. The powers over irrigation are reserved for the states under the Constitution in Section 100, I believe, of the Constitution. So when the Water Act, or when the Water Bill at the time was going through the Parliament in 2007, other heads of power had to be relied on to provide the Commonwealth Government with the powers to legislate in this field. And that has influenced the drafting of the Water Act. And in Section 3, in particular, the objects of the Act, this is most prevalent. When the objects are listed as, and there are up to H, don't know how many that means, objects, but the key ones here in this context are the B, object B, that the objects of this Act are to give effect to relevant international agreements, and all of those agreements relate to environmental issues such as wetlands and migratory birds. And then C, which comes immediately after that object, it says, in giving effect to those agreements to promote the use and management of the basin water resources in a way that optimises economic, social and environmental outcomes. That is a description of this triple bottom line context, but it's important to note that that triple bottom line definition is preceded by the statement that in giving effect to those international agreements. And those international agreements, as I said, are all related to environmental factors. And there is great legal controversy about whether or not those international agreements provide the government and the MDBA the flexibility to act in a triple bottom line manner. I won't go into much more detail, but Section 20 and 21 are also relevant in this context, where the words giving effect to international agreements are repeated, and that Section 21 begins with the preamble that the Basin Plan is to implement international agreements, and later on in that section it says the Basin Plan is to have regard to things such as social, cultural, indigenous and other public benefit processes and the consumptive and other economic uses of basin water resources. Again, those priorities, those economic, those social, those indigenous priorities are all subordinate in a way in those sections of the Act to the overarching environmental factors, and that has clearly given rise to some concern that the Basin Plan won't be implemented in a triple bottom line way. Well, this bill helps to remove those concerns because it clearly states that the bill, or that the government's approach, if this bill, and once it goes through the parliament, the government's approach will be defined by capping the amount of water that can be brought back, and capping it in a way which limits the economic harm caused by reduced consumptive and productive water use in the Murray-Darling Basin. We will instead seek to do those other ways of recovering water, the more efficient, the smarter ways of recovering water, so that that we can act in a way which doesn't harm people's jobs, doesn't take families off their farms, and doesn't cause us to reduce our ability to grow cheap and affordable food. Now, there was something else that said around in speech which grabbed me, that apparently we're doing this to help big water, or big water corporations, or some such. Corporations always seem to be the bad guys in the Greens fairy tales. But the facts are that water licences are primarily owned by, well, actually, they're primarily owned now by the Commonwealth Government, but they're not the ones of interest in this particular piece of legislation. But otherwise, apart from the environmental uses of water, they're primarily owned by family farmers in the Murray-Darling Basin. They're the people that own the asset, but they're actually not the people that we're trying to protect and target with this legislation, because they have an asset, they have a licence. And as much as I want to see farming continue in this country and intensive agriculture to continue in the Murray-Darling Basin, they are not as harmed as other people when water is brought back. Because a water irrigator, a licence holder, has the option under the buyback proposal to sell their water licence to achieve a good price for that asset, and then have the flexibility with those resources to do what they like with the rest of their life. They can move to the Gold Coast, they can buy another farm somewhere else. Indeed, some of them have sold their licences and then bought other licences elsewhere. Indeed, I think Senator Nash would remember well Cal Betzer family, who were able to sell, how much was it? I think $303 million worth of water licences to Senator Wong. You only get one Senator Wong in your lifetime, and Cal Betzer certainly made every poster winner on that deal. $303 million worth of water licences were bought by the Commonwealth Government, and he took off to Africa and bought massive amounts of farms and water licences there, and we were left with effectively just air. I can't remember, but I think, and I will stand to be corrected, but I think that $303 million, Senator Nash bought 109 gigalitres of water, I think. If I was over there, I could ask the departmental advisor, but I think it was about 109 gigalitres, which works out at about $3,000 a megalitre, about 50% higher than the average usual going rate for water. It was a great deal for one of those parties, and it wasn't the Commonwealth Government, and it wasn't the Australian taxpayer, unfortunately. But that's the options available to irrigators. They have that flexibility after they sell their licences, and good luck to them. But there are other people that don't have that option. They don't have that flexibility, because when water is bought out of a small town and economic activity falls, the people who own the motels, the people who own the tyre shop, the people that own the newsagents or the bakers or the service station, they don't have any water licences. They don't get any bailout from the Commonwealth Government, but their turnover and their revenue definitely falls, and their businesses are definitely affected. And that has been an unfortunate consequence of the Basin Plan, but we want to limit that unfortunate consequence. Just last year I was up in St George. She was there a few months ago as well, but last year I particularly went to speak to people in St George, which is a country town in southwestern Queensland, and relies heavily on irrigated agriculture. A big water licence was bought from near a smaller town close to St George called Dirranbandi, and that's had a terrible effect on that town. Agricultural consultants have had to leave because there is no more business for them. The wider business community has been affected, and that's causing quite a bit of harm there. Now, the problem for St George still is that there is still a lot of work to go. That under the Basin Plan, St George is slated to have their water use reduced by around 100 gigalitres. And I should say this is for the wider Condamine-Ballon region, but most of it will come from the St George area under the current proposal. And then there is potentially a common pool amount which would possibly amount to around 50 gigalitres from the area, depending on the review that will be done over the next year. So they're facing a 150 gigalitre reduction. It is about about a 50% reduction in the water used in that district. It's a third of the overall Condamine-Ballon district, but there is, for various reasons I'll go into in a second, at the moment not the plan to take water from those areas. They're going to lose half their productive asset, half their economic asset. Now, the whole town's only there because of this. The St George exists because we built 30 or 40 years ago a place called Beardmore Dam. Other farmers came into the area, they built ring tanks to store water from overland flow and started growing wheat, grains, cotton, all these other products that has sustained St George. Now it'll be a beautiful town, away from the coast in our nation, and we should protect towns like St George, and I certainly want to make sure they continue to flourish in the future. Now at the moment we've achieved 50 gigs or so of that, so we've got 100 to take back, possibly 150. At the moment, around 50 gigs have been recovered in the Condamine-Ballon, and what has been really disappointing is that of those 50 gigs, I think last time I checked it was about 4, but it may have changed, but only about 4 gigs was recovered through infrastructure, was recovered through that option about getting more efficient. The other 46 had been recovered through buyback. And if that proportion continues, St George will no longer exist in its current form, unfortunately. It'll be a much diminished town, and I don't want to see that. I want to protect against that happening, and that's why this cap is very important. This cap is very important to pass, but it's not the only thing we must do to save towns like St George. I'd like to conclude by briefly talking about some other issues that we need to tackle in this field to protect towns like St George, issues that I hope will be taken up in the Select Senate inquiry on the Murray-Darling Basin, which is visiting St George, in fact, on the 29th of September. And I encourage all residents in the area to get along to that hearing, make submissions and have their views heard. But particularly, we have to get smarter at delivering the environmental benefits we want to do. This is not about, for the Greens it's about reducing intensive agriculture. For us that are rational, and I include the Labor Party in that, the rational political parties of this country, it's not about reducing intensive agriculture, it's about protecting the environment. And that's what our goal should be. So when you go up and actually go to St George and go to the area, you learn about the environment. And the Murray-Darling is not just one old big grey carpet, dry carpet like down here on the floor where you put one bit of water down one end of the carpet and it flows to the other. It's not a series of interconnected garden hoses. It's a very different and diverse system. It's a huge area across our country. And in that part of the area, when you put water in and try and deliver a water flow event, often the water will not go down and push down the river system unless there's a big flood. It will bifurcate at the end of these river systems into wetlands. And those wetlands are often the ones we do want to target and provide water to. But we can do that again in a smart way or a silly way. We just buy back water haphazardly and chuck water down the river. There are assets we can use in this region to make sure we get the same environmental outcome without destroying towns like St George and destroying the livelihoods of the 2,000 people that live there and about another 2,000 who live in the area. There are weirs there on the rivers in the Colgoa and the Ballon, that are the rivers in the area, that we can use more efficiently to direct the environmental flows towards those environmental assets in a more efficient way. The Commonwealth Waterholder now is the biggest irrigator in our country. They are the biggest irrigator. They own the most amount of water. They own about 1,160 gigalitres of water right now. They are the biggest irrigator in our country, and they need to get smarter about how they water their fields, just like we've expected farmers over the years to get more efficient at watering their own fields. And they can do that by using assets in this region to make sure that when we put water down the Ballon, half of it doesn't go down the wrong river and end up watering stuff which is actually not that much of a priority or not as important as other environmental assets. There's a weir there we can use and upgrade to direct the water to the appropriate places. And I do give credit to the government that has prepared or had prepared a number of reports on these types of issues recently, but now we need to act in the next couple of years to make sure we do get smarter with this way of recovering water. I would also add we do need to think about getting water from other places than just St George. There are other assets and environmental assets upstream in the Condamine-Ballon region, around Chinchilla and Dalby, which also should be considered, particularly to minimise the impact on St George, but also to help the micro and macro invertebrates in that part of the system, because the final thing I want to say is this should not just be about water. This is about the environment, and just adding water is a simplistic way of trying to deal with this. This is not a cake mix that you buy down at your local shops and just add water to make it work. It needs a lot more sense to get a productive environment in our Murray-Darling system. We need to be smarter about this and actually look at what we are targeting, which is the environment, not people's jobs, which is what the Greens want to do.